The diamond-tipped blade of the angle grinder screamed against the granite, kicking up a thick plume of white silica dust that caught the sharp afternoon sunlight. Holding the heavy tool required a rigid grip, letting the RPMs do the work while my eyes narrowed behind polycarbonate safety goggles. The vibration traveled up my forearms, a steady, punishing rhythm that I had grown to depend on over the last decade. Stone does not lie. It does not change its mind. If you strike it at the wrong angle, it fractures. If you respect its fault lines, it lasts 1,000 years. Releasing the trigger, I let the mechanical wind spin down into a low hum, then silence. The dry California wind immediately took over, rattling the steel scaffolding around the old family farm's central archway. As the dust began to settle and drift across the dry grass, a flash of pale emerald silk appeared, stepping over a pile of crushed limestone. My grip on the grinder handle went rigid, and I killed the power switch without thinking. "Watch your step!" I barked, my voice rough from the grit in the air. Dropping the tool onto the plywood plank, I unclipped my safety harness and vaulted down the 2 tiers of scaffolding. My steel-toed boots hit the dirt hard, sending a jolt up my shins. 3 long strides put my broad frame directly between her and the jagged, unpredictable edge of a recently quarried block. "Regina, there is exposed rebar and loose mortar everywhere down here. You cannot walk through an active drop zone in those shoes." Regina Brown stopped. She was 38, 9 years my senior, and theoretically my employer. As the owner of this sprawling, historic estate, she belonged here. But standing in the rubble, surrounded by heavy machinery, she looked entirely out of place. The wind caught her silk dress, making the fabric look fragile and easily ruined against the harsh industrial backdrop. Her posture sagged, and her dark eyes carried a profound fatigue that had nothing to do with physical labor. "I didn't step on the rebar, Caspian," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual commanding timbre. She looked at the ground, then back up at me. "You were about to," I insisted. My hands hovered just an inch from her shoulders, my fingers twitching with the urge to physically steer her backward to the safety of the manicured lawn. Forcing my hands down to my sides, I curled them into fists. "Stand behind the yellow tape, please." She didn't retreat. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, looking up at me, covered in a thick layer of gray dust, wearing a heavy leather apron over a canvas work shirt. I looked exactly like a man who spent his life wrestling boulders out of the earth. "I don't need a contractor right now," she said, her voice dropping into a tight, desperate register. She looked down at the soft, flowing fabric of her emerald dress, grabbing a fistful of it until her knuckles turned white. "I need armor. I need you to be my personal stylist." Staring at her, I waited for a punchline that didn't come. I pulled off my goggles, wiping a streak of sweat and stone dust from my forehead with the back of my thick leather glove. "I am a stonemason, Regina. I hit rocks with a 2-pound hammer for a living. I don't know anything about clothes." "I look soft," she continued, ignoring my protest. "I look like someone who can be easily pushed over." My cousin Vance's lawyers were just here again. They looked at me. They looked at this dress, and they saw a pushover. Meeting my eyes again, the raw vulnerability in her expression made my jaw lock. "I watched you work yesterday," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of stability. "You understand armor. You understand how to make things look heavy, immovable, and dangerous. I have to walk into a mediation room next week and fight for my grandfather's land. I don't know how to be hard anymore. So, I want you to build my armor. I want to dress like someone dangerous." The wind rustled the dry leaves of the ancient oak trees behind her. I looked at the fragile slope of her shoulders, then up at the massive 80-ton granite archway I was currently stabilizing. She wasn't asking for a fashion critique. She was asking for structural engineering for her soul. "Go back to the main house," I instructed, shifting into absolute, serious compliance. "Put on a pot of coffee. I need 20 minutes to clean my tools and secure the site. Then we will evaluate your foundation." 2 hours later, the environment had completely changed. Standing in the center of Regina's massive, cedar-paneled study, the air smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and lemon polish. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, currently buried under a chaotic avalanche of legal briefs, property maps, and threatening letters bearing the embossed logo of Vance Commercial Development. This was the crisis. Vance, her estranged corporate cousin, was exploiting a loophole in her grandfather's 1980 will. The will stipulated that the estate remained in Regina's possession only as long as the original historical markers, specifically the central stone archway, remained intact and structurally sound. Vance had petitioned the county to declare the archway a safety hazard. If it was condemned and dismantled, the historical trust dissolved, and Vance's firm could force a liquidation sale to build luxury condos. Marcus, my 22-year-old apprentice, was out by my truck mixing a test batch of lime mortar. It was just Regina and me in the quiet study. "Vance knows I'm bleeding capital," Regina said, sitting behind the massive desk. She rubbed her temples, her eyes squeezed shut. "If he pushes this to a protracted trial, I bankrupt the farm just paying the legal retainers. He wants me to settle, to surrender the lower acreage." Walking around the desk, I didn't offer her useless platitudes. I looked at the letters, scanning the aggressive, legal typography. The familiar, heavy urge to step in front of her, to take the paper away and handle the threat myself, flared up in my chest. "Let me see the letters," I said, my hand extending, hovering over hers. "I will draft the structural counter-assessment. You don't need to read these." Caspian. She opened her eyes, slapping her palm flat against the documents. The sharp sound echoed in the quiet room. "Do not shield my eyes. I am paying you to rebuild the stone, not to shelter me from my own family." Pulling my hand back, I nodded slowly. It was a fair correction. I was treating her like glass, and she needed to be granite. "Understood. But you didn't call me in here to look at paperwork. You called me in here for styling." She exhaled, standing up, wheeling a garment rack into the center of the study. "I wore this to the last meeting," she said, pulling out a beige cardigan and a soft silk blouse. Crossing my arms over my chest, I analyzed the garments with the same critical eye I used to find faults in a marble slab. "It lacks geometry," I stated bluntly. "Geometry? Architecture is about projecting strength through lines," I explained, stepping closer to the rack. "A flying buttress doesn't look soft. It looks like it can hold up the sky. That cardigan has sloped shoulders. The material yields. It visually drags you downward, telling the room that you submit to gravity." Pushing the beige fabric aside, the metal hangers scraped harshly against the bar. I reached in and pulled out a tailored, charcoal black blazer with sharp lapels and a rigid, structured shoulder line. I held it up. "Put this on." Regina took the jacket and slipped her arms into the sleeves. Stepping behind her, I kept my hands hovering just an inch from the fabric, making sure I didn't crowd her space. "A keystone bears weight by distributing it outward," I murmured, focusing entirely on the alignment of her posture. "If you collapse inward, the structure falls. Square your shoulders. Lock your spine." She pulled her shoulders back. The sharp cut of the blazer immediately transformed her silhouette. The soft vulnerability was masked beneath rigid, unyielding lines. "Now," I said, moving to stand in front of her, "when you walk into that room, you don't smile. Stone doesn't smile. You don't lean forward to accommodate their questions. You force them to bridge the distance to you. You are the foundation. They are the weather. The weather breaks against the foundation." Regina looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the study window. "They are the weather," she repeated, her voice dropping an octave, finding its steel. Turning back to the desk, I tapped a heavy, calloused finger against a framed 1920s photograph of the archway sitting near her lamp. "The mortar joints around the keystone are deeper here than the rest of the span," I noted, logging the structural anomaly in my head. "Your grandfather used to say the original masons left a truth box in the core. If it's real, it means the center is hollow. We have to be careful when we brace it." The next morning, the California heat baked the dust into the back of my neck. Up on the third tier of the scaffolding, I used a masonry chisel to carefully remove the crumbling historical mortar from the keystone. It was agonizingly slow work. One wrong strike with the mallet, and the entire arch could destabilize. handing Vance his victory on a silver platter. Down on the ground level, Marcus was sorting the heavy replacement stones by density. "Caspian!" he yelled over the sound of the wind. "We've got a suit approaching!" Lowering my hammer, I saw a man in a sharp navy suit walking up the gravel driveway. He carried a leather satchel and walked with an arrogant, entitled stride. A legal courier. Regina stepped out onto the front porch of the farmhouse, wiping her hands on a towel. She started walking toward the driveway to meet him. My overprotective reflex triggered instantly. Hooking my hammer onto my tool belt, I grabbed the scaffolding rail and swung down the levels with practiced speed. Hitting the dirt, I kicked up a cloud of dust and intercepted the courier 10 feet before he reached Regina. "Can I help you?" I asked, physically blocking his path. I crossed my arms, forcing him to stop. Towering over him by 4 inches, my boots planted firmly in the gravel, I didn't leave him any room to maneuver. The courier looked at my dust-covered clothes and sneered. "I have a legal notice for Miss Brown. Step aside, contractor." "I handle the intake for the property site," I lied smoothly, holding out my gloved hand. "Leave it. Caspian." Regina's voice was sharp, cutting through the standoff. I turned my head. She was wearing the charcoal blazer we had picked out. She looked immaculate, her jaw set, her posture perfectly aligned. "I will take my own mail." Looking at the envelope in the courier's hand, my instinct fought back. "Regina, it's just another harassment tactic. Let me process it first. I can read it and summarize the relevant facts without the intimidation language." "No," she said. "It wasn't a request. It was an absolute boundary." Holding her gaze for a long second, I deliberately uncrossed my arms and stepped entirely out of the way. Moving to her left side, I stood shoulder to shoulder with her, a silent reinforcement, but kept my hands firmly at my sides. The courier smirked, handing her the envelope. She took it without breaking eye contact with him. "You can leave my property now," she said, her voice carrying the exact weight and permanence of granite. "Before my contractor escorts you to the county line." The courier's smirk vanished. Looking at the hard, unyielding expression on her face, then glancing at my sheer physical size, he decided to walk away without another word. Waiting until his sedan disappeared down the dirt road, Regina finally tore open the envelope. Her hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Reading the single page, her shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch, but the blazer hid the worst of the defeat. "It's an expedited inspection notice. Vance pulled a favor with the county zoning board. The municipal engineer is coming on Friday at 9 in the morning to evaluate the archway. If the keystone isn't fully stabilized and load-bearing, they condemn it on the spot." Looking up at the massive stone structure, I did the math. Today was Tuesday. That gave me exactly 72 hours to complete a restoration that should take 3 full weeks. "Then we work through the nights," I said simply. The farm quickly became a theater of endurance. Rigging high-intensity halogen work lights around the scaffolding, I turned the night into a harsh, artificial day. The rhythmic clinking of my hammer and chisel against the stone became the relentless heartbeat of the estate. On Wednesday night, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold coastal fog rolled in from the valley, leaving the metal scaffolding slick with moisture. I was on the second tier, calculating the precise angle for the next shim, my arms burning from the sustained effort. Footsteps clattered on the metal grating. Regina climbed up the ladder, carrying 2 heavy ceramic mugs. Wearing a thick wool sweater, her hair tied back in a messy knot, she looked entirely exhausted. "You need to stop for 10 minutes, she said, holding out a mug. Placing my chisel down, I took it. The heat of the ceramics seeped through my thick leather gloves, a sudden, welcome shock to my freezing hands. "I can't. The curing time for the historical mortar is incredibly specific. If I don't set these joints tonight, the lime won't bond, and they won't bear the load by Friday morning." She didn't argue. Standing beside me, she leaned against the cold metal railing, looking at the massive blocks of stone I had painstakingly realigned. "I brought coffee," she said softly. Taking a sip, I noted it was black, exactly how I took it. The fog was dampening her hair, and she shivered slightly in the cold night air. Without a word, I unbuttoned my heavy, fleece-lined canvas jacket. Slipping it off, I draped it over her shoulders. The jacket swallowed her, but it offered immediate, heavy warmth. Pulling the lapels together, her fingers gripped the rough fabric. "You'll freeze, Caspian." "I'm generating enough body heat swinging a hammer," I replied, picking up my chisel again. I just noticed a vulnerability and patched it, the same way I filled a crack in the stone. Watching me work, she listened to the precise, rhythmic strikes. "You treat the stone with so much care," she murmured over the sound of the wind. "It's a foundational marker," I said, tapping a wooden shim into place to hold a joint open. "It's been here for 100 years. It has a right to stay." "Do you think Vance will win?" she asked, the fear stripping away the blazer's armor she had worn earlier. Stopping my work, I turned to face her. The dark circles under her eyes revealed the sheer exhaustion of fighting a war on her own doorstep against a man with bottomless resources. "He only wins if you let him dictate the terms," I said quietly. "I will make this stone unbreakable by Friday. That is my job. But you are the one who has to stand in front of the inspector and defend the deed. I can build the wall, Regina, but you have to hold the gate." Tightening her grip on my jacket, she nodded slowly. "I'll hold the gate." Thursday afternoon, the day before the inspection. The air on the site felt heavy, thick with the unsaid stakes. Marcus and I were executing the most critical phase of the restoration. We had rigged a massive chain hoist to a steel A-frame gantry above the archway. We needed to lift a 300-pound slab of replacement limestone perfectly into the gap above the keystone to distribute the compressive weight. Regina stood on the grass below, watching the process, her arms crossed. "Okay, Marcus," I called out. Gripping the rough edges of the suspended stone, I felt the immense gravity pulling it downward. "Give me an inch of slack. Slow the release." The heavy iron chains clanked. The paw clicked rapidly. The massive stone lowered a fraction. Using my entire body weight to guide it, my boots braced against the scaffolding to keep it from swinging. The physics required absolute precision. If the stone swung too fast, it would shatter the historical corbel beneath it, ruining the structural integrity and failing the inspection automatically. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind caught the heavy canvas tarp we had rigged for shade. It snapped loose, whipping with the sound of a gunshot directly toward the hoist chain. The sudden noise startled Marcus. Flinching, he stepped back, his hand slipping completely off the release lever. The brake disengaged. The chain screamed through the pulley. The 300-pound stone dropped 6 inches in a sudden freefall, swinging violently on a pendulum arc directly toward the delicate, hand-carved edge of the historic arch. "Caspian!" Regina screamed from the ground. In a fraction of a second, muscle memory took over. Throwing my shoulder directly against the swinging face of the limestone, the impact drove the breath from my lungs. It was a brutal, unforgiving collision of bone and rock. Gritting my teeth against the shock, my boots slid backward on the metal grating. Locking my knees, I used my leverage and lower body strength to absorb the massive kinetic energy, halting the swing just 3 inches before it smashed into the historic archway. "Lock the brake!" I grunted, my muscles burning. Marcus lunged forward, slamming the lever down. The chain caught with a violent jerk. The stone hung motionless, pressed hard against my shoulder. The entire site went dead quiet, save for my heavy breathing and the wind flapping the loose tarp. Slowly stepping back, I rolled my shoulder, checking the clearance. The arch was safe. Looking down, Regina had a hand pressed tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I gave her a single, reassuring nod. "Lower it," I commanded Marcus, keeping my voice perfectly flat to ensure the panic didn't spread. We guided the stone into its final resting place. It slotted in with a deep, satisfying thud. The arch was stabilized. The load was distributed. That evening, the adrenaline finally wore off, leaving a deep, throbbing ache radiating from my collarbone. Sitting on the open tailgate of my truck in the twilight, I carefully cleaned the silica dust from my tools with an oiled rag. Regina walked out of the house, carrying a small plastic first aid kit. She was back in jeans and a simple cotton sweater. Walking up to the tailgate, she set the kit down with a clatter. Let me see your shoulder, just pull the collar back. It's just a bruise, Regina. Occupational hazard? You threw your body in front of a falling boulder to save my grandfather's archway, she said, her voice tight with unshed emotion. Move the collar. Caspian, unbuttoning the top 3 buttons of the stiff canvas work shirt, I pulled the fabric down over my arm. The skin over my right collarbone was already blooming into an ugly, dark purple contusion, swollen and angry. She stopped at my side, bracing a chemical ice pack with both hands. She snapped it to activate the cold and pressed it gently against the worst of the bruising. Hissing through my teeth, my muscles locked instinctively against the temperature drop. Sorry, she whispered, her fingers making functional, necessary adjustments to the edge of the pack. It's fine, I managed to say. The first aid kit rattled on the tailgate when my knuckles tightened around the metal edge. I forced my eyes back to the plastic latches of the box, choosing absolute restraint over the impulse to crowd her space. She was vulnerable right now, fighting for her life's work. I would not confuse the lines. I found something, I said, redirecting the moment back to the safety of the job. Reaching behind me with my good arm, I picked up a heavy, dust-covered canvas bag and set it on the tailgate. Regina stepped back slightly, her brow furrowing, taking the ice pack with her. What is it? Remember the deep mortar joints in your grandfather's photograph? I checked the depth this morning. I unzipped the canvas bag. Inside sat a dull, heavy rectangular box, corroded with a century of age. There was a cavity behind the keystone. It's a cornerstone time capsule. Regina stared at it, her hands dropping to her sides. Can you open it? Pulling a small, flathead chisel and a rubber mallet from my belt, I examined the edge. It's sealed with lead solder. It's soft, but I need your permission. Do it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Angling the chisel against the seal, I tapped the mallet. The soft metal yielded easily, splitting along the seam. Prying the lid back, I found a stack of yellowed, brittle documents wrapped in thick oilcloth, alongside a solid brass surveyor's stake. Regina reached in, her hands shaking, and pulled out the documents. Unfolding them carefully, she scanned the faded ink. A slow, disbelieving smile broke across her face. The heavy weight she had been carrying for weeks seemed to evaporate into the night air. It's the original deed, she breathed, looking up at me, her eyes shining in the twilight. And the original land survey from 1910, signed by the county commissioner. Check the bottom right corner, I advised, pointing with a calloused finger. Look at the raised watermark. She ran her thumb over the thick paper. That's the county clerk's official seal. Vance's 1980 map is a clerical error. It was drawn incorrectly after a county rezoning, but this predates it by 70 years. This proves everything. Looking from the paper to the archway, standing dark against the sky, the relief in her posture was absolute. You found the door, she said. No, I corrected quietly. I just moved the rock. You're going to walk through it. Friday morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was sharp and clean. At 9 a.m., 2 black SUVs crunched up the gravel driveway. Vance stepped out of the first vehicle, adjusting his tie, accompanied by 2 lawyers holding briefcases. From the second vehicle, a man in a hard hat holding a clipboard emerged, the county municipal inspector. Standing near the scaffolding with Marcus, I wore clean jeans and a fresh flannel shirt. My work was done. The archway stood behind me, massive, unyielding, and perfectly stabilized. The fresh mortar was clean and bright against the weathered granite. Regina stepped out onto the porch. She looked immovable. Wearing the charcoal blazer, her shoulders were squared, her spine locked in perfect, unyielding geometry. She walked down the wooden steps with a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded total attention. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who owned the ground she walked on. Vance stopped at the base of the archway, a smug smile plastered on his face. He looked at the inspector. Obviously, the structure is compromised. Just look at the patch job. We need the condemnation order filed today so we can begin the teardown. The inspector raised his clipboard, looking up at the arch. The structure is sound, I stated, stepping forward. I didn't yell. but my voice carried effortlessly. The load-bearing capacity has been restored to code, the mortar is historically compliant, and the keystone is secure. You can check the laser levels yourself. Vance glared at me, dismissing me instantly. I don't care what you patch together with glue, contractor. The 1,980 deed explicitly states that this arch lies on the contested boundary line. Without a clear historical title, the Preservation Trust is void. Regina walked past me, stopping exactly 3 feet from Vance. She didn't flinch. She didn't yield. Reaching into her leather portfolio, she pulled out a heavy, transparent evidence sleeve. The 1,980 map was a localized clerical error. Vance, Regina said, her voice ringing clear and cold in the morning air. She held up the sleeve. Inside was the yellowed 1,910 survey and the heavy brass stake. This is the original founding survey, retrieved yesterday from the cornerstone cavity. It bears the raised seal of the 1,910 county clerk, legally superseding your document. The boundary line extends 50 yards past the archway. The trust is intact. You have absolutely zero claim to this land. Vance's smug smile vanished. His lawyers immediately leaned in, their eyes darting over the visible signatures and the official county seal on the antique document. The color drained from Vance's face as he realized his leverage was entirely, permanently gone. This is a fabrication, Vance sputtered, taking an aggressive step toward her. Shifting my weight, a silent warning, I stayed rooted to my spot. I supported her agency. I let her fight her own war. Regina didn't need my physical shield. Standing her ground, her eyes locked onto her cousin's. The county inspector is standing right here, Vance. He can verify the municipal seal. If you attempt to file another fraudulent challenge, or if you ever set foot on my property again, I will have my attorneys file a malicious prosecution suit that will bankrupt your development firm before the end of the fiscal year. She paused, letting the silence drop like an anvil. Get off my land. Vance looked at the documents, looked at the undeniable structural perfection of the stone archway, and finally looked at the absolute, dangerous certainty in Regina's eyes. Turning on his heel, he walked back to his SUV without a word. His lawyers scrambled after him. The inspector spent 20 minutes reviewing the archway with his laser levels, signed the clearance forms with a nod of professional respect toward me, and drove away. The farm was quiet again. Marcus started breaking down the scaffolding, humming quietly to himself. Regina stood near the base of the archway, looking up at the restored stone. The wind caught her hair. Reaching out, she placed her hand flat against the cold granite. Walking over, I stopped a few feet away. The mortar needs another week to fully cure, but it will hold, I said, keeping my tone professional. The job was done. My reason for being here was over. Pushing my hands into my pockets, I looked at the driveway. I'll have Marcus email the final invoice to your office on Monday. Regina turned to face me. The dangerous, sharp edges of her corporate armor seemed to melt away in the sunlight, leaving only a profound, radiant warmth. I don't want the invoice, Caspian, she said softly. Closing the distance between us, she didn't look fragile anymore. She looked anchored. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. Holding it out to me, the sunlight caught the brass key on a simple leather ring. The key to the farmhouse? I signed a 12-month preservation contract with the Historical Society this morning, she said, her eyes searching my face, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Paid on the 1st of every month. I need a master stonemason on retainer. And I booked the mediation room myself for Tuesday to finalize the boundary lines, no more hiding behind letters. She pushed the key an inch closer. But I'm hosting a small dinner tonight to celebrate the preservation ruling. I want you there. Not as my contractor. Not to fix anything. Just you. It was a clean, practical choice. No dramatic speeches about love. Just concrete actions that redefined our future. I looked at the key, a symbol of absolute, terrifying permanence. Pulling my hand out of my pocket, I reached out and took the key. My fingers brushed against her warm palm, and I didn't step back. I don't own a suit, I warned her. A small, Genuine smile breaking through my stoicism. Regina smiled back, a bright, unburdened expression. That's fine. I hear I have an excellent personal stylist. I close my hand over the key. Yeah, you do. The end. Closing thoughts. The angle grinder sat quiet on the grass. The brass key felt heavy and warm in my pocket, and the old stone archway finally stood on its own. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.